Still working on it. Today's reading comes from the book of Luke 21:15. In this passage, Jesus is speaking. For I'll give you the words and a wisdom that none of your adversaries can take exception to or contradict.
Good morning, St. Andrews. Good morning. It is always a pleasure to be here. I haven't been here in a while and had a good time at 8 o'clock. I had a good time. I don't know if everybody else had a good time, but I had a good time. This morning, I feel humbled and privileged to be able to share the message with you that came through me. And I hope you'll walk with me as we explore this way to be greater light in a world that sometimes seems to be descending into darkness. And I'm grateful to be here so that we can really think about this on World Communion Day. And I think it's World Communion Sunday, right, Babs? I'll get that right. I want to talk a little bit, and you've seen this title, want to talk to you a little bit about our rights and then our responsibilities as well. We have rights in America. Courtesy of our Constitution, we have a lot of rights. And as I've said earlier, it's not that Constitution is not perfect, and our rights are sometimes under fire. But we have the right to speak. We also have the right to be silent. And some of you know that the right to be silent is one that we usually get to protect ourselves. And even if you've never been arrested, and some of us have been arrested, and I know in St. Andrews, we protest and we take that risk to be arrested. But if you've never been arrested, you probably know the Miranda rights from Law and Order or some cop show, right? You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to speak to an attorney and have that lawyer present during your questioning. If you cannot afford a lawyer, one will be appointed for you if you desire. As Americans, we get this. We get the ability and the privilege not to incriminate ourselves. But today we want to talk about a little bit more about silence, the silence that works and the silence that doesn't. And so first of all, silence is incredibly powerful in other contexts, in some contexts, I should say, particularly when we're listening to someone at the heart level. When we're listening and we're listening carefully, silence sometimes can help us to really metabolize what's being said to us. It's also silence is awesome when we're meditating or reflecting or out in nature. However, remaining silent when other people are being falsely accused or persecuted or oppressed is counter to who we are as followers of Christ. And we know there's a time for everything. We live in a world right now where we know that a lot of people are being persecuted, people are being falsely accused, falsely labeled. And one of our favorite scriptures about due justice and mercy. A lot of times to do justice and mercy, we have to speak up. And so as followers of Christ, we don't have the luxury or the privilege of being silent, especially when things are pretty difficult. And difficult situations is where it's the more difficult the situation, the more difficult it is for us to speak up. And unfortunately, we live in a world where there are many opportunities to speak up, but we also live in a world, in a country where there's been a history of punishing people, sometimes by death, sometimes by whipping, for standing up for people who are powerless, people who do not have privilege. And the threat that comes with speaking up sometimes silences us so that we protect ourselves. And one example of just one way, and this happened in Austin, Texas in the late 1800s, it was punishable by whipping for African American and Mexican people to talk to one another. And of course, that law is no longer on the books, but it was on long enough to leave a history and some roots that still live with us today. And so as followers of Christ, we have to pay attention to which laws make sense, which ones to be challenged, and when to speak. Humanitarian and Holocaust survivor Elie Wiesel told us, we must take sides. We have to. Neutrality helps the oppressor and never the victim. Silence encourages the tormentor, never the tormented. And the opposite of love is not hate, it's indifference. So sometimes to protect ourselves, we don't speak. We're silent. As followers of Christ here at St. Andrew's, we have a habit of speaking up. It's one of the reasons why I love coming to this congregation. This is a congregation that's not afraid to be a social justice movement in and of itself. LGBTQ rights, immigrants' rights. And we have to become a contagion at St. Andrew's. Other people have got to learn to speak, and we've got to learn to organize with others. Because just in Jesus's day, there were abuses of power, religious power, governmental power, state power. We have the same thing. We have the same opportunities to speak up. We have no evening news. There are no social media posts without the chaos of injustice. And from every system in the United States, education, health, military, police, there's injustice that has to be spoken up about. And most of our faith communities in this world, we get instructions on speaking up and speaking up for justice to disrupt justice. Even in the Quran, in Surah 4 and 135, it says, "O you who believe, be persistently standing firm in justice as witnesses before God, even if it be against yourselves or your parents and relatives." Something about that should resonate for us as followers of Christ. We get those same instructions that we are to be love. And many times to be love, we have to speak up. We have to break our silence. Because we have a superpower. Have you all ever had these conversations with people and they say, "What is your superpower?" Anybody familiar with that? What's your superpower? And, "Oh, I cook quiche, in 15 minutes." Everybody's got this superpower. But as followers of Christ, we've got a superpower. We're outsiders. We're outsiders. We are maladjusted to injustice. And that puts us in the powerful position of being able to disrupt. But we have to recognize that power is within us. And so your superpower, if you take nothing else away from this talk today, your superpower is being connected to the Spirit, being a follower of Christ, and being able to disrupt. So one of the great examples we have in American history of outsiders being disruptive is in the civil rights movement. In the 60s, when dehumanizing and degrading conditions for African Americans in the South, Black people from the North came to the South. White people from the North came from the North to the South. Jewish people showed up in droves. And when we learn about Jewish people who showed up to support African Americans, they recognize the danger of silence. So I want you to keep in mind that silence is complicit with oppression when we don't speak. But we have examples in America where people have taken stands, apartheid in South Africa. We know that silence means that we are participating in oppression. So here at St. Andrews, we've spoken up, as I said, over the decades. Some of you have been to the Capitol, you've been everywhere. For immigrants' rights, for LGBTQ rights, you have been there. You have paid attention to what's happening in the world. And today on World Communion Sunday, I want you to consider what else is going on in the world. Other things that call for us to speak up. Maybe not you personally, maybe not us as a congregation, but certainly followers of Christ have got to get involved. So if you look at how we can break our silence, you can look at almost every continent. The first place I want to take you is to a space where all of you have cell phones. How many of you have cell phones? Smartphones, the technology, all these lithium batteries, they require cobalt to function. 40,000 Congolese children make sure we have our cell phones. That requires a disruption, y'all. 40,000 children mine cobalt that we know of in the Congo to fuel the rest of the free world. Every cell phone has to have this raw material. And this year in American Magazine, Shmuley Yakovitz pleaded for all religious communities to show up for the Uyghurs in China. Who are the Uyghurs? They're the Muslims in China. And they are being destroyed, they're being exploited, they're being systematically exterminated, silently and quietly, while we're caught up in the madness of our elections and all of the drama, the Facebook drama, the Instagram drama. People are being exterminated during our lifetime. In a few years, somebody may look back and say, what were y'all doing when the Uyghurs were being exterminated? How were you speaking out? How were you using your platforms? It's hard to speak out about what you don't know. And so I'm grateful to Mr. Yanklowitz for making this known. And he continues to write and talk about all faith communities coming together to stop the madness in China. And I don't need to tell you that Gaza is aflame and Lebanon is on fire as well these days. We have a metastasizing war, and no one seems to be able to stop it. And hundreds of thousands of children, both Palestinian and Jewish, are being killed. And we're stuck. Some of us as followers of Christ have spoken out, and some of us have just gone to silent because there's the fear. The Biden administration is repealing a great program they had for migrants, a 2-year parole program for Haitians, Venezuelans, and Cubans. And they decided, you know what? You all are going to have to find a different path. So the program was suspended. And so we have hundreds of thousands of people who are fleeing terrible conditions. And our country has told them, there are other paths. You're just going to have to find them after inviting people to apply and come here. So we've got a lot of ways that we need to show up. And last but not least, because you know this is not an exhaustive list, we have Native Americans fighting for their right to at least have a voting site on reservations that are in isolated spaces. So people who have been here for centuries are having to beg the courts to just give them a space to vote. And I don't need to tell any of you all, women all over this country are fighting for the right to control their bodies, their own bodies. These are all things that are happening, and these are not all things we can solve. But there are some things that are close to home. Voter suppression in San Antonio with Latino voters is repugnant. The state is persecuting folks, mostly Hispanic folks, and voter suppression is very real. Many of us want to change this world that we live in. We can't change this world if everybody can't vote. But right here in San Antonio, there are raids for people who are suspected not to be registered or to be voting illegally with no evidence at all. Our Texas public education system is being totally dismantled right in front of our eyes. State of Texas is sitting on $18 billion, and that money is not being released to schools for all kinds of political reasons. And schools now are having to fire teachers and librarians and cut incredible programs that are needed for our immigrant children, for our children who are identified as low income, our emergent bilingual children. Many of our children, they get most of what they need to thrive in our public schools. And our state is taking the system apart by starving it to death of funding. On World Communion Day, we need followers of Christ to show up. We need followers of Christ to show up, whether it's an international issue, whether it's a regional issue, whether it is a local issue. There's no shortage of injustice out there. And what keeps us from speaking up? Some of us are pretty good at speaking up about different things, but I'll speak for myself. When I'm in a situation where I feel surrounded by people who don't share my faith and my belief, I sometimes will shut down. I'm afraid because I'm human. You're human. And none of us wants to be ostracized, left out, punished, retaliated against. And sometimes we sit in silence so that we can still belong. But as followers of Christ, we are maladjusted to this injustice. And when you're at the Capitol protesting, an arrest may come. If you join the university protest for peace in Palestine, arrest may come. That's the risk. And so sometimes it's easier just to watch it on TV. And this doesn't mean everybody has to go down to the Capitol, y'all, because that's not everybody's call. But keep in mind that what we've been called to do, we have to honor and we have to show up, because silence is what keeps us going. And then sometimes we have on those phones, we have strange and dehumanizing posts that are made about other human beings that we may not share their background. And we take the chance to disrupt and refute the dehumanization, and then we get canceled, right? We take the risk of being canceled by groups, or wind up in these situations where people start to attack you personally because you spoke up for Haitians, because you spoke up for Venezuelans. You saw something that made no sense and you spoke up. Those are the risks we take. That's why we're told by the Spirit that regardless of your situation, Jesus delivered this message, right? Spirit used Jesus to deliver the message that whenever you're before the authorities, whenever you need to speak, I'll give you what to speak. And so that's when our faith kicks in. We either have it or we don't. And so a lot of times when I'm cogitating, like, ooh, what should I say? Oh no, they might be offended by that. That may sound this kind of way. I have to get still and see not what Stephanie is trying to say, but what is the Spirit trying to say through me if I will open myself up to it? Now, the season is coming where you will be sitting at tables with people with whom you share DNA. You might not believe it because of some of the stuff that comes out of their mouths, right? And you'll have to determine in these holiday events, in this season of very interesting in America, what are you to say when someone says, oh, Mexican immigrants are taking all of the American jobs? What are you to say? You in spirit, Jesus gave the instructions. You'll get your instructions on what to say. I sometimes ask myself, do I want peace or do I want drama? Because you do know in some cases, there's going to be drama if you disrupt some kind of remark about the dehumanization of particularly marginalized people, people with very little power. Some of us have remained silent. I just know that here at St. Andrew's, we have the ability to change things. We have the ability to become this contagion that is so necessary in this time when we see abuses of power. And speaking up is an act of love. It's the way we show love, especially when people don't have our privilege and our power. It's not an act of charity, because once you speak up for the oppressed, the marginalized, you may not be a member of the LGBTQ community, but as a follower of Christ, you have an obligation to walk and join with, not to be an ally. Maybe an ally is the first step, okay? We like to talk about allies, but as an ally, as a straight person, I can step in and out of being an ally. It's optional. But once I really put skin in the game, that means I take a risk of being ostracized, being rejected by family, being rejected by people I love. I got skin in the game now. Now I'm a co-conspirator. I'm an accomplice at taking down oppressive systems and people who denigrate others. So again, don't leave here and say, Stephanie said allyship was bad. I did not say that. What I said was it's a first step. But as followers of Christ, we have to get in with people. We suffer with people. We don't sit at home and hope it all works out well. So speaking up in the spirit for marginalized is, as I say, an act of love. As followers of Christ, we do not have the right to remain silent. We don't. As followers of Christ, we know anything we say can and will be guided by Spirit and used in the defense of love. So as I leave you in a moment of reflection, I want to thank you for traveling this road with me this morning, thinking through. Some of the things I've shared with you were on the paper and some were not. They just came from somewhere. I want you to reflect with me on the lyrics from a song from the Keres Indians of Laguna, Puebla. I add my breath to your breath, that our days may be long on the earth, that the days of our people may be long, that we may be one person, that we may finish our roads together. May our mother bless you with life. May our paths be fulfilled. Thank you. I invite you to your own reflection this morning.